It is now 6:30. Let me call to order the City of Oak Harbor Planning Commission regular meeting, May 28, 2019. The roll call this evening, let the record show that Commissioner Phillips is not here this evening. Second on the agenda is the approval of the minutes of April 23. Do I have a motion?
I'll make a motion to approve the April 23rd, 2019 regular business meeting.
I have a motion. Second?
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Same. Approval of the minutes passes. Number 3, public comment. Seeing that there's no one in the audience to make public comment, I will go to item number 4, public meetings. Senior Planner Kat Kamak will speak with us about parks, recreation, and open space plan update. Kat?
Good evening. Thank you very much. So here to present the Parks, Recreation, and Open Space Plan. This plan is not new to the Commission. We update the plan every 8 years or so. So it's going through another round of update. So most of the information should be familiar to most of the commissioners. However, I'll go through and provide a summary of what's in the plan, and then we can open it up for questions. So what's in this update? So the plan was last updated in 2009. And the 2009 plan, so in the planning world, when we update plans, we do not start from scratch. We actually take or borrow heavily from previously adopted plans. So so all the ideas or goals and policies that are contained in today's plans started with the first park plan that was adopted in Oak Harbor back in the 1960s. And the plan has been adopted amended several times, and things get struck out or added, and that's how the plan evolves over time, 8 years at a time. So most of the things that you see in their goals and policies especially are from previous plans. So what did the update do? It made some minimum changes to the plan structure. In 2009, the plan was restructured. The information was mostly similar to the previous plans. But the structure of how the plan was laid out was changed. So this time we didn't change much to the structure of it, and I'll go over it in a little bit. Goals and policies and projects, they were updated with the help of the Planning Commission, the City Council, and the Park Board. We had a joint meeting. We discussed all the goals, kind of went through each goal individually, chatted about it, struck out the ones that didn't make sense, combined ones that seemed similar. So we did all of that at the beginning of the planning process. And then what we have in the plan are ideas that are captured on how we want to move forward with the park system, and that's mostly in the recommended plan. We've updated the level of service. Level of service is similar to, this is a system that they use in the transportation world in terms of intersection. How much wait time do people have before they make turning movements, and then if you fall below a certain threshold, it's labeled level of service D, F, and you can choose as a city you want to be level of service B, and if something fails, then you look at that intersection and try to design it so that you can meet your level of service. So it's just a way of looking at parks, and I'll go over that in a little bit. And a 6-year implementation plan. This is kind of requirement by the state to have it in your plan, so we have that. And one of the things that we did not do with this plan update is change the methodology or any information on the park impact fee. That's going to, at least for right now, remain the same. That could be dealt with as a separate topic. It's a financial issue, and the City Council can decide at any time to either change it or have it reviewed. As part of this update, they just plan not to take it up as an issue. So I'll start going through the level of service information. I think that helps kind of lead into the recommended plan. So I'll just kind of touch upon the level of service details before we jump into the recommended plan. So level of service. So the parks plan uses two types of ways to measure the level of service. One is called the spatial method, and this is basically trying to determine whether we have parks within the city that are easily accessible by neighborhoods. So we have a lot of neighborhood parks in the city. They're distributed all throughout the city. And so if we gave every neighborhood park a half-mile radius of service area, what would it look like? And so we did that analysis to see, because I think that's a good area. It's a national standard, actually, for neighborhood parks to have a half-mile service area. So we did that for Oak Harbor. However, we did something special here. What we did was we took into account the major streets, Highway 20 and the arterial streets like Whidbey Avenue, and Midway Boulevard and Regatta. Those are major streets. So even if you have a neighborhood park 2 blocks on the other side of Highway 20, let's say, that's a natural barrier. And even though you're within a half mile of that park, it probably is not servicing your neighborhood or your house. So there are some pockets within Oak Harbor that could use neighborhood parks, and that's been identified. And I'll show you a map I have on the slide. So for community parks, it's about 1 mile. It's a larger park. They have larger recreational facilities, so they serve a larger area. People usually drive to these locations. And so we give them a coverage of 1 mile. And so that way you can see what area of town is not covered by a community park. So people in that area are driving longer distances to go to the community parks. If you have something close, then that helps the transportation system as well. You're reducing that many trips through a certain intersection. So you try to distribute that throughout the city so you have good access for everybody. Another type of level of service methodology we used is the ratio-based methodology. And this is for recreational facilities mainly. And again, this follows kind of a national standard, 1 tennis court per 2,000 people, or 1 baseball diamond for every 5,000. There's some standards there, and those are listed in the plan. So we look at all our recreational facilities that and match it up with the population, and then determine whether we have adequate facilities to meet our population demand. So that's another level of service system that we've used in the park plan as well. So not a very good map. There's a copy in your document, but I just wanted to put it up there. So this is the map that shows the level of service for neighborhood parks. And you can see from the map, we have all the green areas are areas that are covered by neighborhood parks. They have service. The white areas are ones that are probably close to neighborhood parks but don't have that service because of that arterial street that I was talking about as being a barrier. So if you note, one of the areas that jumps out is this area on the east side of Midway and south of Whidbey Avenue. It's a nice little pocket of residential houses. They have parks around them. They have amenities that's pretty close, but within that area, there's actually no neighborhood parks. Similarly, you can see that Scenic Heights area. They have access to the Scenic Heights trailhead. They can get into Friend Marsh, and they have to walk to Windjammer Park for a playground. But in their area, they don't have a neighborhood park. So for all the neighborhood parks we have, there are pockets within the city that doesn't have them. This map allows us to identify them, and when there's opportunity, at some point, at any time, if land becomes available, or if there's some donation or a chance to work with another agency to provide a park, we'll take the opportunity to do that. And this map allows us to focus in areas where we don't have those facilities. This is the level of service for community parks. This is the larger 1 mile radius. The 3 parks that kind of are at that community park level are Fort Nugent Park, Windjammer Park, and Volunteer Park. Those have most of the recreational facilities. So if you draw a mile around them, you can see that they cover most of the south and southwest portions of the city, but you have this northwest quadrant by the Crosby and Heller Road area, which have a lot of residential developments, they don't have access to the community park as easily as some of the other areas do. So this is a simple way of kind of looking at evenly distributing services around the community. So that's what the park plan attempts to do and provide some direction on that. And we all know that there are some talks about acquiring some land for a community park there, and that's ongoing, and that's captured in the recommended plan as something for us to, for the city to pursue. And if that land could be acquired and developed into a park, that would serve, meet that level of service and provide that service for the community. It's a quality of life type assessment. So, with the, so this is also captured kind of in number format. So, there's some ratio-based standards for even quantity of parks. National standard, it says, you know, for neighborhood parks, you want to have at least 1 acre for every 1,000 people that you have in your city. And for community parks, you want to have at least 4 acres of community parks for every 1,000 people in your city. So if you take that into account, in Oak Harbor currently, we have about 33.85 acres of neighborhood parks and about 83 acres of community parks. If you kind of look at how much acreage per thousand, so the neighborhood park, you have 1.49 acres per thousand, which is slightly higher than the 1. So it seems like you have a higher area-wise, more neighborhood parks than the national standard, which is good. And so therefore, when you project that as a need, you have, you know, actually currently we have 11 plus acres of more land than the standard, basically, is that number saying. So you have adequate quantity of neighborhood parks. That's not a problem. Location, precise location, that's something to work on in the future. Community parks, it's prescribed to have 4 acres per thousand, and if you see in 2018, we had about 3.66, so it's a little less than the 4-acre national standard. And we know that and we feel that in the community, and that's why we're looking for that additional parkland. I know our Parks Division feels the demand for it from all the organized sports and so on. They couldn't have enough facilities, and they are all so crunched in that season. It's not that you can sometimes spread them out over the year. They all come in at a certain season, and they have a big demand on the number of facilities that they want to use, and we don't have sufficient facilities to satisfy that need. And that kind of shows up over there. So in 2018, what is the need? Currently, we could use an additional 8 acres of community park. And if you keep projecting the population in 2036, which a 20-year projection is pretty standard in growth management, you know, population-wise, land use-wise, all of that is a 20-year window. So 2036, you'll be short 20 acres. So we know that going into the future, we're going to be short on community acreage, community park acreage. So that's something that you want to acquire. So your analysis shows the need for community parks moving forward. Oh yes.
In this document, where it says that we're short 8 acres 2018 need, does that take into consideration Fort Nugent Park belonging to the school? Because this document says the school wants to build. Yes,
well, not that particular number doesn't include that. And none of my calculations in the plan take away the 20 acres from Fort Nugent because it's not for sure, right? We kind of know that they're going to have it on the ballot and potentially, you know, have it for a facility, but till that point in time, we're going to count those facilities as part of our service. But we are including in the plan, in the recommended plan, there is verbiage about the potential for losing 20 acres. So if you lose 20 acres, you can just add 20 to all of that. and that'll become 27 and 40 acres. That's kind of what it'll be.
CAC, I have a couple concerns about the county's involvement. I don't think there's any county parks north of Coopville, is there? Is there any?
Not in terms of recreational facilities.
Well, I'm going to address like Rhododendron Park and, Coopville, are you familiar with that?
Uh-huh, yes,
That's a county project, correct?
yeah.
So how is it that they get afforded this kind of treatment and we don't? And we have a much larger population base. I don't understand that.
I'm not sure if the county is under the GMA to plan for parks and provide the services for parks just like urban environments do. And I think the county does recognize, and we've had conversations with them, they do recognize that they don't have facilities in the north side of town. And so we're looking for collaboration with them anytime we do community parks. So in that way, I think they may have helped with Fort Nugent, and Steve will know a little bit more information on that.
CAC is absolutely correct. They were a financial contributor to the development of Fort Nugent Park early on in the park development stage. And we hold that out as an example to them of the kind of participation that we would encourage them to re-engage in. It's been some time since they have, but we do continually or fairly frequently remind them that the parks inside of the city of Oak Harbor serve county residents as well. And so we haven't had much of a contribution lately, but it's still a topic of conversation.
Yeah,
Well, I would think they would have more availability to lands than the city of Oak Harbor does to designate for parks. Am I,
They used to
Right.
actually have some land holdings inside of our corporate limits. Those were actually sold, to the best of my knowledge. And so what's been the best way for them is for them to donate money to the city or be our partner. They were part of the development of the phase one of Fort Nugent Park. And we have sought to encourage their participation in other parks as well. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if we're successful in acquiring the 75 acres on the north side of our urban growth area. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see the city make a formal request to the county, asking them to be our partner once again in the development of that park.
okay, thank you.
and our goals capture that. I mean, we work with the county as much as we can. We work with the school district, so that's part of our goal, is to work with other agencies so that we can share facilities. So this is this table is also in the plan. It's the ratio-based analysis for recreation facilities, and again, this is one facility per 1,000. So for example, let's take basketball courts. First, it's recommended that you have at least one basketball court for every 5,000, and that kind of gives you how many basketball courts you need at the current time and how many you need 20-year projection. So this is kind of a way to kind of just gauge our need. Now, tennis courts, for example, we have the need for 6 or 8 in the next 20 years. Different communities are different. I mean, tennis may not be a big thing for Oak Harbor, so there is some local discretion in terms of how you want to do this. So just because the numbers point out that this is what the need is, doesn't mean that you have to go and build these tennis courts. You still kind of like gauge it with public input and see what the demand is and provide what you think is needed. For example, I think in this time around, pickleball courts were one of the popular ones. So that's what, there's no standard for it in the national standard, but it is picking up as a pastime in the country. And so we're trying to provide for those. So we're trying to respond to the community's need and not just go by numbers, but these are ways to just kind of gauge where we are as a community. So recommended plan, as I mentioned, the level of service points to underserved areas in terms of neighborhood parks and where we can look for opportunities. But it also recommends that we continue to invest in neighborhood parks as city grows. You still want to try, and that's a very good service that the neighborhood parks provides for Oak Harbor. There's not too many communities that have that many neighborhood parks, so it's a good thing, and Oak Harbor should continue to invest in that. Community parks, the level of service established that need in the northwest quadrant. We're in communication with some property owners on that. And so development of a park in that area will be very beneficial to the city. And I think there's language in the recommended plan that captures the idea that maybe Fort Nugent could go away, or even the possibility that there's been conversation about the fields down here by Windjammer Park, and the need for it to be moved to some other location just because of the weather and so on. So just displacing existing facilities is going to require land, and that's not taking into account what you need in the future. So just to displace 20 acres of Fort Nugent's facilities and some of Windjammer's facility, you need 20 plus acres just for that. And then if you calculate the need, then you need more than that. That's why the 70 acres is a nice target to shoot for in our future planning.
And
Yes.
CAC, is there any usable space on the city-owned property on 7th Avenue wetlands area?
I don't think there's enough space for recreation facilities, but for open space, because this is a parks, recreation, and open space plan, wetlands, the parks plan considers wetlands as amenities. And so, I have a map here of the future trails layout. That's what it's trying to do, try to connect all these natural resources through trails and stuff. And that's open space and trails, and which are part of the parks and recreation plan. So you may not get recreation facilities out of it, but you'll still get open space use. You get trails maybe if you develop that area. And that, jumping into open space, that's kind of what we've listed as things to work to invest in as the Northeast 7th Avenue wetlands. We've got the newly formed Gary Oak Grove that's right as you come into the city. It's an open space of land where development is challenging because of the accident potential zones. So that has been kind of a nursery for Gary Oaks, and hopefully that'll become a Gary Oak Grove in the future. And then you have Front Marsh, which is a great amenity to have right by on the water, and trails and open space opportunities there as well. So the trails are lacking in Oak Harbor. We have the waterfront trail, which is a great asset, and a lot of people use it. But other than that, there's no real network of trails for the citizens to use, and so that's something that the city can invest in. Northeast 7th Avenue wetlands is an area where that can happen in the city on the north side. The Whidbey Avenue corridor is a corridor that has most of our public facilities. If you look at it, all our schools are lined up there. The swimming pool is lined up on there. The fire station is lined up on there. We got commercial areas. It's a very busy corridor with functional uses. And the park plan captures, along with the transportation plan, captures connections within these areas so that you can reduce trips, basically. So if you have residences or any development within there, or if you improve Whidbey Avenue, you want to think about trying to include your complete street system, which has bicycle paths and pedestrian pathways in it, so you can try and save one automobile trip and try to reduce the impacts on the system. Pioneer Way and Waterfront, again, these are great event centers for the city. During the weekends, people come down to this area, and you, again, we don't, in Central Business District, you all know that parking is not a requirement, so they can build lot line to lot line. And so when you have events and when you have gatherings, people are going to come down to this area. You want to try and reduce the number of trips. You want to try to get them to walk or ride their bikes. For that, you need good pedestrian connections and make it easy for them to do so. And so this just captures a plan to find an opportunity to do that. And then trails around the city, and I may have a map for that. And this is kind of a long range. Again, like I said, trails are deficient in Oak Harbor other than the waterfront trail. Eventually, if you can imagine a trail system that connects all around the city, it would be a great asset to have. The county has their trails plan. They have a lot of grand ideas about trails in the county, connecting from bridge to boat and so on. And they have a lot of other trail projects that are just outside of Oak Harbor. And if we can plan to build our system and eventually connect with theirs, I mean, it's just a matter of time before we can have a network of trails. So this kind of, all the nodes are mainly natural features or areas that will remain open space, whether it's wetlands or forested areas or state park. And if you can find ways to connect these features through trails, mostly through development or through street projects, then, this allows us if a development happens somewhere along Swantown, let's say along Swantown over here, and that's in the UGA. Let's say they annex into the city and they want to do a development. Now, because we have some kind of a trail connection shown here, we can tell them that you need to incorporate some kind of trails into your development. Whether you do it as a dedicated trail or whether you put it right adjacent to a street, that doesn't matter, but we want to have some kind of a connection through here so you can do it. So, for example, the one subdivision we're looking at we're currently reviewing it in the southwest quadrant. You can see that we have this dotted line that goes along there, and so we've through our development review requested that they consider that, and so they're providing through their design a 10-foot wide multi-use trail along the street, so it'll be wider than a sidewalk, and it'll be a trail. So eventually you connect and you can go all around the city. Anytime you do a city street project that doesn't have a sidewalk or a trail, currently if you do a street project and if it's in the plan, you try and incorporate those into it. So that's the long-term plan for trails in Oak Harbor. So one of the requirements is to also have a 6-year kind of an implementation project list in your plan, and that's what we have in our plan as well. This is kind of a very schematic list of projects that the city hopes to do in the next 6 years, and there's a timeline, rough timeline on when those things are likely to happen. And this, some of this is adopted with the capital improvements plan, so it's not just a wish list. These things are kind of on track to do, which is great. And I have a table in there, I think, and this is, format is slightly different, but it has all the projects and the costs, and it's basically the table from the capital improvements plan in here. So there's a strong connection between the park plan and our implementation tools. So I will stop there. That's a brief summary, a lot of information. I have as you know, that it's going through the adoption process. I'm hoping that I can share this information with the park board at their next meeting and take their comments, and then come to Planning Commission at your next meeting and hold a public hearing for it so that you may make a recommendation to the City Council, and then we'll work through the adoption process to July. So I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
So CAC, right now, you're not planning on any new impact fees or taxes or anything? This is all just kind of budgeted out, is that?
Yeah, the impact fees were calculated. The methodology that was used to calculate the impact fee was done quite a while ago, early 2000s. We used that in 2009 while we adopted the plan based on, there's some population, there's land values all kind of thrown into that formula to assess what it would cost, or what is the impact to a residential unit. Basically, they're the ones that pay the impact fees for it. We updated that, and so the process is the same, and we updated it. We went to City Council with those numbers. Those numbers were actually considered high at that time in 2009. So and it was also the time when we were kind of going into the economic downturn in 2008, 2009. So the City Council chose to kind of just cut that by 50% at that time. So we haven't done, through this planning process, we haven't looked at any of the dollar amounts in terms of impacts, or whether park impact fees or additional taxes or whatever needs to be collected. So this plan is not recommending any of that.
Thank you.
So it was kind of a little hard to go through this without having the red line version. So I was looking at it with the old version on the computer. One of the things that I liked about the old version is that when you got into talking about the individual parks, it had a chart on the bottom that told basically what needed to be done in each of those parks. And that old version, the 2009 version, didn't have the capital improvement plan chart in it that you have now, because it basically has taken the place of that. But what you end up doing is you end up losing, I think, a lot of the things that didn't get funded in the capital improvement plan that still need to be done. So, for example, if you looked at Windjammer Park under the 2009 plan, it talked about how the bridge needed to be redone, about how the lagoon needed to be, needed some updates. Well, none of those things got funded in the capital improvement plan, but they still need to be done. And so how do we capture that in this new version? That's one of the things I liked about the old one. So any thoughts on that?
We looked at that section because it was attached to the level of attention and then also the project list. And we felt most of the things that were listed on those, on some of the other parks, were getting done. And so there would have been blank sheets with LOA and with not much at the bottom. So we knew a few parks needed it, and other parks, we didn't have to want to list the entire parks system. So that's why, as you said, we kind of knew we'd capture it in the capital improvements plan as we get through because we're connecting it to the CIP with the actual implementation. You get all that playground equipment costs going in. One of the things that happened previously is, in order to get into the CIP, your project had to be $50,000 and plus. So sometimes when you do these playground, they don't quite qualify for the 50,000, so they didn't get into the capital improvements plan. So we had to find a way to list it elsewhere. Now our Parks Division has wisened up and they found different ways to do it, and so they're kind of like buying playground equipment for like 2 parks at a time. And so now it has become $50,000 or more, so you start to list these projects in your CIP, so you capture it in that way. So that's why we thought, okay, we'll save some sheets of not having any information in there. We still capture the level of attention for every park, and then we'll capture it in the CIP. So that was the basis for taking those sheets out.
And the level of attention, I question some of the numbers for some of the parks. How does that get determined?
I work with our parks manager, and he has the level of attention numbers, so I leave it up to him to tell me what it is that he's doing or would like to do.
One of the other things that they've talked about a little bit in City Council and hasn't been seriously approached is the issue of how to protect Windjammer Park from the storm surges. We had that big storm, 2-3 years ago that really,
Right up there, yeah.
March 20, whatever year it was, 2016, that really wiped out Windjammer Park. Did you want to talk to that?
Well, I think I can give you some idea. So it is absolutely something that Public Works staff is taking very seriously. Right now, we're working with them on some permitting issues for where one of the more problematic areas right now is on Pioneer Way. Not too far from Passaic, where we've been talking about that one project for a long time, but we've got quite a bit of erosion there along the shoreline, and so we know we have some immediate needs, and Dennis Lefevre, one of our senior planners, has been helping Public Works with the permitting side of that. We've also been looking a little more seriously at our dike over there at Friend Marsh, recognizing that we've got some issues there. And I know Kathy Rosen, Public Works Director, really wants to do a comprehensive look at the shoreline to see what sorts of remediation should we be doing in those areas.
So what plan does that kind of stuff show up in, and if it doesn't show up in the Parks and Open Space plan?
You know, I actually see it as its own separate study, because it's not so much a parks issue as it is an infrastructure protection issue. So I would see it being its own document, because, well, not that this would necessarily be related, but for instance, FEMA has funding sources available for this kind of work. You just have to figure out how to actually tap into that. And it starts with a baseline condition and understanding what your needs really are. So I think I would see it as its own separate thing. Mr. Oborn has something, I
Yeah,
think.
some of the shoreland erosion, it affects water and sewer
Yeah.
lines, it affects streets, so it's multiple funding. We did put it in the capital project, some shoreline is one of the things we added in there. And then while I'm speaking, I'm just gonna go back up to the issue with the impact fees. Good issue there. From an operating point of view, just so you know, parks and recreation are the last areas, and they compete in the general fund, and they really have difficulty getting funding. And so we're not adequate. There's a real fear that we open up this regional park, we figure out the millions of dollars we need to get that regional park in the north area, and then we just do not have the adequate funds for the operating. So it's really difficult. So finding funding is for park and recreation, especially on the operating side. Sometimes we could find it with grants on the capital side and putting the projects in, but I mean, there's a real fear in trying to maintain the Windjammer with the way it is configured now, with the staffing levels. And then there's a real fear that we're going to add additional park and just not increase the corresponding staffing level and operating budgets to accommodate it. So it's a real challenge, and something I don't know, it's an indirect concept, but it's something I think the community needs to be aware of, that challenge in getting funding, because they compete in the general fund with police and fire and other city functions, and so it's just really difficult, and it's really easy. And recreation is one of the areas we're a lot more active in recreational activities, and it's one of the first things that goes when a recession hits and when a downturn hits. So that's a really long-term challenge to get adequate funding for operating our parks.
So talking about the impact fee, the last study was done in 2004. You know, standards have changed. We talked about this with the RV park, right? Where the RV park, when it was built, all you needed is someplace to park an RV. And now people are expecting drive-throughs, and they're expecting sewer hookups and water hookups and electric hookups. And, you know, when I was a kid, a ball field was someplace where you put down some sandbags,
Yeah.
and you went out and played ball. Now people are expecting bleachers and, you know, fences and all this kind of stuff. So the impact fee study in 2004, which is already 15 years old, I mean, when is it time to do another one?
Well, actually, I think Kathy Rosen, Public Works Director, has been trying to include it in an overall rate study that the city is underway with. The challenging aspect, and I'm not going to tell you folks anything that you don't already know, is that while you can certainly determine what that fee can and should be set at in order to fund the park improvements that your community desires, it's a different thing altogether for that fee to be put into place, right? Because the other arguments that you will hear is that this is an additional cost on the price of housing, and it's affecting, you know, somebody's bottom line, or it's quote unquote affecting affordability. And so it's always a balance, and we see the same thing with our transportation impact fee as well. And the same thing with water and sewer system development charges, although those are a little easier because you can tie those to capital a little bit easier, capital projects. We absolutely think that there's room for that fee to be adjusted so that the city's not subsidizing that park construction to the degree that we are right now, but we also recognize that there are other factors at play when that ultimate decision is being made. So, but the last I heard, I believe Mrs. Rosen is trying to include that in the last piece of the rate study that they're currently working on.
Steve,
We'd be happy to report back to you next month on that one.
Steve, you know, when they introduced that, in fact, it's coming up now, the additional, is it city tax to fund roads and repairs? Is that?
We're still working on the transportation benefit
Right.
district, yes.
Right. Is there Can you do a district for parks and recreation also, the same way?
I believe that you can. I'm not sure how that works when we already have a Parks and Rec district inside of our same geographic boundaries. But,
Yeah,
you know,
right.
we would be open to all funding sources. Of course, the challenge part is to get the general citizens to approve something like that.
Well, that would, by definition, define the need then. If they feel the need, they would approve it. There are no free lunches. It just doesn't work that way.
You won't get any argument from staff on that.
Yeah, when you talk about service, I always say that we can't provide services for free, so
Yeah, well,
it's a cost.
I mean, if enough people want it badly enough, they will pony up and
Yeah.
pay for the amenities.
Yeah.
I'd like to add, we've been hearing more, through the paper and various committees and things about the different impact fees, the transportation fee, and different things that the state is doing to impact us as an island and as a city. And I know that I've been on the island only 10 years, and I know that the neighborhood I live in, when I moved in 10 years ago, my property taxes were like $2,900 a year, which I thought was fairly reasonable. But then when I started looking at what the city's portion of that $2,900 was, it was absolutely ridiculous. The levies were getting all the funding, and the city was getting nothing to talk about proportionally. And now it seems like being with this body, we look at this different discussions. We just built a mega park out here. We know that we have storms that destroys the waterfront. But is that even considered as an issue when they're planning this? If we have a flood or we have a 100-year rain and the ponds that we have around can cause flooding, we have no way to address this. And that's what's just, concerning to me. Just like with the highways, I'm just so used to budgeting highway repairs, and I know when that's going to happen, and it doesn't seem like we do that here in this state.
I think we do, and maybe it's just not as visible as either you're accustomed to, Mr. Freeman, or maybe the city could do a better job in sharing that story. Let's just take Windjammer Park and the issue of stormwater as an example. We've been working on different stormwater problems down there ever since I joined the city. And for a very long time, we were trying to fund the 42-inch outfall project down there. And eventually we were able to fund that. And it's made a big difference. It's not been the silver bullet. We still have some flooding issues in that area, but we have a sort of a long-term strategy in terms of how we're approaching those problems, and we expect that in the next couple of years, some additional improvements will be made in the system that take the pressure off that particular area, and so the 42-inch outfall will work even better. And will completely alleviate, or almost completely alleviate, flooding in that area unless we get, truly the perfect storm happening at a particular point. So those kinds of things are happening, and we have the systems in place to make that happen. We did absolutely look at storm surge and sea level rise as part of the conversation when we did Windjammer Park. Of course, a lot of the grade in there was raised 2 to 3 feet for a couple of different reasons, but it has the benefit of keeping it up out of the floodplain in certain areas. It doesn't address the shoreline issue that Mr. Hovey brought up by itself, but as I've mentioned, we have a strategy in place for that. So we have these pieces, and maybe what we just need to do a better job is the storytelling that lets our community know that we are in fact thinking about these kinds of things.
Well, some of the things I'd just like to carry a little bit further. We're out in front for all the schools and for the computers and for everything else. But when we start talking about real infrastructure, the deterioration, and what the city is experiencing with the deterioration of the roadways, I don't think we put enough emphasis on that. We'll say yes to the parks. We'll say, or to a park like this one here. We've spent a lot of money on that project. We spent a lot of money on Pioneer Park, and everything else goes by the wayside. That's the frustrating part that I see as an individual, and I'm just not used to seeing it like that. I'm used to seeing the planning piece of it, and this can happen, especially with being an island like we are. What happens? But I still see that small number going to the city, for improvements, and I see a much, much larger number going to the levies, which could be county, schools, fire, all of that, even sheriffs. And they're all moving forward to come up with more projects now. But how do we maintain our cost or our funding levels that we need as a city, as a jurisdiction, to maintain what we have?
Well, it's a little off our park plan subject, but I think Mr. Wassinger brought up the Transportation Benefit District. That's a perfect example of how we're trying to address it. We see this need in the local streets, right? And a lot of this, and I know that you know this from your background, but a lot of this has to do with the funding source. We can't mix different pots of money because we're prevented by law from doing so. So the monies that we can spend on sewer systems, we can't spend on water and we can't spend on storm drain. Right? Now, we can get a little creative from time to time, stretch it, get a little bit of extra pavement out of it to repair a street. And so, Hal, that's probably more likely how we're going to fix some of the shoreline areas. You won't see a shoreline funding source per se, but we'll be able to tap into water and sewer and storm drain funds to a small degree, because that's what we're doing, is we're protecting that infrastructure behind that shoreline, right? And so that's how we can fund those kinds of things. On the local streets, that's always been the most challenging aspect, because the dollars that we can normally get through the federal government that pass down to the state through the RTPO and the committees that CAC works with, those fund federally designated streets. We can't use those on our local streets. But every day that we drive around in our neighborhoods, unless you live in one of the newer ones, you see the state of our local roads. That's what the Transportation Benefit District is intended to do. That funding source will be dedicated to our local streets. Simultaneously, our Public Works Department has been working on an evaluation of the pavements citywide, so that we know which streets are in the worst shape and which ones do we get the most bang for the buck in repairing right now or overlaying right now, and which ones are too far gone to use precious dollars on, and let's just wait until we actually have to rebuild that whole street. And so our staff goal is to take that work, and if the Transportation Benefit District is successful, marry the two of them together, and that's how we'll start to address some of these problems. But you're right, if you just look at what we get out of that property tax, you want to think it's a mistake.
Well, I just
there
think
has to be a digit missing in there somewhere.
I just think that we need to have a seat at the table, and we need to be a more responsive seat at the table in some respects to everybody that has a lobbying group working. The park had a lobbying group to get what they've got built out there. It happened, and part of that was the sanitation program. I understand that. But they got all they wanted in that park, and then some. And it just seems like funds are being pulled from other areas that need attention to build that.
So maybe my last comment on this that hopefully will make you all collectively feel a little bit better, is that we have a more robust budgeting and capital improvement process right now that was instituted last year through the work that CAC did, as well as Patricia Sold, our finance director, and then the people from Public Works. We really have a much better integration between our 6-year CIP and our 2-year budget. Finance director has taken it upon herself to do some pretty solid 6-year budget forecasting. And so we're really trying to make a much stronger connection between the identified needs and how we go about funding those kinds of projects. That's the way that I think we make progress in this area. There's not a built-in constituency for improving your storm drain system. I mean, there's not people out there saying, fix our storm drains. I mean, that just doesn't happen. The sewer plant sort of caught fire, so to speak, as something that we really needed because it's very visible. But the rest of infrastructure, as we all know, is below ground generally, and folks don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. That's why we have folks like Kathy Rosen and her fine staff, is to tell us when we need to be replacing that. So hopefully, as we continue to move forward, the connection between the CIP and the budget will get even stronger. And that's how you'll see, I think, real progress being made.
So, the last comment I've got, under the community input, that survey that y'all did a couple years back, it says that that's gonna be included in the appendix, but it's not in the appendix, so that'll come.
The entire, yes, it's coming. You'll have it at your next meeting.
Baby steps.
Actually,
Yes.
I'll jump in. Well, you guys take a stab at it if you want, but I'm not in love with this document, and I understand the time constraints that you have to work with, but I'm disappointed that there isn't going to be more structural revision of this. I find this really, Steve mentioned storytelling. I find it very hard to discern the story here that we're telling about parks and recreation and open space from this document. There are these three sections of the document. They don't always seem to have good ties between them, particularly in going from vision to guiding principles to goals to the recommended plan. I find it kind of hard to see how these things all meld together. I did the same thing Cal did. Took a look at this with the old document on my computer screen. Didn't spend enough time on it, so I apologize for that. But it really, there's an enormous number of goals here. It's hard to tie these goals to the data that you have in the back about the inventory and to the things that come forward. So I'd like to see some tighter connections made between that, referring back to maybe which piece of the guiding principles each of these goals touches on. If we're going to rely on the capital improvements document for some of this work, then it would be great to have references in here and say, we touch on this in more detail in the CIP. One of the things that I am encouraged by what Oak Harbor does and disappointed at the same time. Oak Harbor does a much better job than Island County does at putting this kind of documentation up on the website. It's still hard to find some of these documents there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It would be great to have, for example, I looked through meeting packets for a couple of years to get back to the 2009 edition of this plan to make that comparison. There might be some other place I could have looked, but I did not find it.
There's just as a quick footnote, there's
Sure.
a new website eventually is coming out. We anticipate having a much cleaner access to our documents as a result of the reorganization of the web.
The
That would be
website's online,
delightful.
by the way. The new website's online.
I haven't seen the live version yet. Okay.
Came out 2 days ago. Or Friday or whenever.
I should have known that. I
If
apologize.
you go to the Oak Harbor website, it says, here, try our new website.
Oh, I didn't even see that link because I jumped in right to the planning page. But the real core of the question I have here is there are definitions of community parks, there are definitions of neighborhood parks. This definition of community parks does not adequately describe the parks that are designated as community parks back in this table. So, for example, Hal Romali, thank you, is designated as a community park. It's a half acre. I don't understand why it's a community park and not a neighborhood park.
It's because of the nature of that facility, and something that may have been lost literally in the translation is that the city has long used a neighborhood park and a community park process for designating our parks, but there were 2 or 3 parks that quite some time ago actually had both designations, because from a size perspective, they were more neighborhood, but from either their location or their function, they might have been more community park side, or park oriented. And so probably two versions of the plan go. There was that clear distinction in there, and that might have been lost, but that's why you'll see that one in particular is characterized as a community park.
Okay.
Yeah, and some of it may have, and I'll jump in as well. That was one of those, as I mentioned, there are some things that transfer from plan to plan to plan to plan, and as the plan goes through different iterations and things get added, we always find at the very end there are some things that don't connect very well, and then we try and tackle it at the next adoption process. So one of the things that came through, as Steve mentioned, was this double designation of neighborhood parks and community parks for some of the parks. And when we started getting into the park impact fee calculations and so on, these parks were kind of like in the way, so to speak, because they didn't clearly fall into any one of these categories. So for the longest time in the old plan, there was language that said, yeah, they are small, they're not community parks in character, the Hal Ramley Park and then the Gary Oaks Park,
Smith Park.
Smith Park. They don't have recreation facilities, but they're community assets. They're kind of invested in differently than you would, a neighborhood park that's in the northwest of town. So that's why they were, and in adjusting again, this table is becoming more of a conversation piece. I feel like I want to move it to the appendix because that is one of the carryover tables that I'm trying to maintain from these old parks where, every time I look at it, I'm like, okay, this doesn't make sense anymore, but more and more things are being caught in that. So that's one of them. And going back to, and I totally understand there's not much of storytelling because I think the document is in a transition state still. The vision was not touched at all, and so could there be work on the vision? Absolutely, but that's a lot of time spent on visioning alone. So during this update, it was decided that we'll go to the goals and policies, the vision, that's it. So, and when you go into the goals and policies, those goals and policies are again carried over from many years. So you will see in some of the goals, you can see the old language and the new language goals, they are kind of different. But people, when going through the goals, didn't want to lose some of the ideas. Now, we have some language in the recommended plan that's more of a storytelling, let's say the Fort Nugent, not the Fort Nugent, the new community park. We haven't captured that as a goal necessarily. In past years, they would capture that as a goal and as a goal statement. So it kind of like a project becomes a goal statement of sorts. And so you'll still see some goal statements that are similar to that, and that's just because the community doesn't want to have that lost, and so it is retained in the plan. At some point, maybe it does become a story form where you're starting to actually plan to implement something, and then you'll see more language in it. So there is some disconnect, and I totally understand that.
Maybe it would help if there was a little more clustering of the community park pieces and the neighborhood park pieces, because when I was going through and I reached the inventory of existing facilities, I can't see any rhyme or reason to how these facilities are listed. There's some that are neighborhood parks, there's some that are community parks. They're all kind of in together, and it's hard to make heads or tails of it.
Absolutely. So
And
that's
I
another.
understand why that would come
Yeah.
about, but if this is a document that's usable by the average citizen who takes the time to go out to the website, you can see them getting discouraged really quickly.
Just another point on that. Actually, there was some categorization at the last park plan. When if you compare it, we separated the city into quadrants: northwest, southwest, and we grouped the parks in that way. We in the 2016 update to the comprehensive plan, we adopted a new land use element that included neighborhoods.
Right.
So we had some discussion internally whether we should show them, classify them as neighborhoods. And we looked at the map, and it was starting to get very cluttered, and not very easily readable. So we thought, okay, this is just an inventory of facilities that people are familiar with. This is something that we have to have in our requirement in terms of what do we have. And so we just categorized them all into one category as opposed to the areas. But we did go through some thinking process.
But maybe
Okay.
we can make some fine tuning adjustments between now and next month.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I think we talked about this maybe last year in the context of the transportation plan. I think it's great and valuable that there's so much carryover between the 2009 version of this document and the one that's in production. But, and I can see that reflected in some places, but not in others. So where we have goals, I think it'd be very useful and confidence building for the citizenry to see, oh, here are the goals we had in 2009 that we achieved. Here are the ones we had in 2009 that we haven't achieved, and maybe a moment, a few words on why do we still want to do those, or are we dropping from this? Admittedly, this would make this document a lot thicker, which is not necessarily a benefit, but just so that people get an idea of first of the continuity of these plans, since there is some, and what the direction is, the trend is that we're going with this kind of work. I think would be very useful.
Good point, thank you.
Okay, that's it.
Any other questions, comments?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Is there anything else for the good of the order this evening? If not, the meeting's adjourned.